Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first live session and Zoom of this 81st session. Commerce and Labor, 81st session of the legislative session. So, Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Senator Hardy? Here. Senator Lang? Here. Senator Neal? Senator Pickard? Here. Senator Scheibel? Here. Senator Settlemyre? Here. Chair Spearman.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Let the record show that all of the committee members are here. Today we have a hearing on Assembly Bills 290 and 366. I want to take a moment to go over some basic housekeeping items. As you know, the legislative building is now partially open. Therefore, some presenters and some public testimony will still be conducted in person through Zoom, video conference, or by telephone. There are various ways members of the public can engage with us and participate throughout the process, and this includes registering to participate through Nellis, where you have an opportunity to testify on a bill, request to join a meeting in person, or provide public comment. You can submit written comment to the committee using the email or the fax address listed on the agenda. Share your opinion on Nellis, view committee meetings online through Nellis or the legislature's YouTube channel. To register on Nellis, simply click the Participate button near the committee meeting date and time and fill out the information that is asked of you. Once you register, you will see a confirmation screen, and you will also have an email with a phone number and a meeting ID to call at the time of the meeting. Just a note that while you are required to register to participate, it does not guarantee you will be able to speak. Similar to previous sessions, comment and public comment may be limited due to time constraints, and I will announce the time frame for all of these for, against, and neutral. It will be helpful that if more than one person in an organization wishes to comment, to remember that ditto is a good response when someone has already made your points. This allows us to get more people's comments on the record. When you're on the phone line, please pay attention to which bill is being considered and follow the verbal prompts provided by the BPS staff, so you know which keys to press to raise your hand or to unmute yourself, and staff will call on you to speak by the last 3 digits of your telephone number. If you need assistance with any of these processes, or if you would like to receive electronic notification of the committee's agendas and minutes, please contact our committee staff at the email listed on the agenda. Any and all exhibits for the committee must be submitted in electronic format no later than 8:00 a.m. the day before the meeting. Contact information may be found on the committee page on Nellis. In addition, any person proposing an amendment to a bill that's being heard by this committee must first talk to the sponsor. Let them know that you intend to submit an amendment. I will not entertain any amendments if the bill sponsor is not aware of that amendment. The proposed amendment must be submitted in writing 24 hours prior to the meeting. So please include the bill number, the statement of intent, and your contact information. And when you are testifying, please remember to unmute your microphone and clearly state your name and the entity you represent at the beginning of your testimony. Speak clearly and project your voice. Remember, we have some who are listening to this meeting over a computer that may not be an iPad or may not even be 2008 or less or earlier. So please remember to project your voice. A reminder to all those who testify, pursuant to Nevada Revised Statutes, NRS 218E.085, it is unlawful for a person to knowingly misrepresent facts when testifying before a legislative committee. A person who knowingly does so is guilty of a misdemeanor, and the chair or any member of this committee may request a testifier to submit documentation supporting your testimony. Committee members, if you are virtual and have a question, please raise your hand through Zoom. Through the Zoom application. If members are not on Zoom and participate from the committee room, please unmute yourself to let me know that you have a question. And finally, please put all of your electronic devices, especially the cell phones and laptops, on silent mode during the meeting. And with that, let us begin our hearing on Assembly Bill 290. Assemblywoman Hadigi, Mr. Alonso, and I imagine you have some more people that are virtual? Yes. Okay, so we'll open the hearing on Assembly Bill 290. I'm sorry, AB 290. I'm used to saying this now. Assembly Bill 290. It revises provisions relating to financial institutions. So, Assemblywoman, begin when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Chair and Vice Chair and members of the committee. I'm so happy to be here and see so many familiar and friendly faces in person and friends with me here. I'm happy to be your guinea pig for your first in-person meeting, so go easy on me. I'm Assemblywoman Sandra Howdigi, and I proudly represent Assembly District 41. Today, I'm here to present Assembly Bill 290. Assembly Bill 290 was worked on with the industry representatives who will be here presenting with me today in consultation with the Director of Business and Industry and the Commissioner for the Nevada FID. Knowing this would help bring opportunity to our state and in an effort to learn more about the industries that come through commerce and labor, I was happy to lend a vehicle for this bill. Assembly Bill 290 revises the definition of a fiduciary to provide that a trust company or a savings bank that acts as a custodian for an individual retirement account is not a fiduciary for the purposes of certain provisions of law governing the business of a trust company. Madam Chair, with your permission, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Robert Woltz with Charles Schwab for further remarks. And we also have Mr. Jeff Brown with Charles Schwab and my friend Alfredo Alonso to help answer questions. Madam Chair, having an education budget closing that I stepped away from, I was hoping you would not mind if I excuse myself from the presentation, and I promise that I am leaving you in good hands.
You may, but everybody that does that must come back and sit in timeout. But
Thank you, Madam
okay,
Chair,
yeah.
and with your permission, I would like to hand it over.
Sure. And for those who are presenting and for those who will ask questions, no need to go through me. Go directly to the member that you want to answer the question for. So with that, have fun, Assemblywoman. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Alonso, please proceed.
Chair Spearman, members of the committee, Alfredo Alonso with the law firm of Lewis Roca, today on behalf of Charles Schwab Bank. This is essentially part two of what this body debated and ultimately passed last session, which dealt with bringing some updates to Nevada law with respect to banking law. We had a savings bank or a savings and loan statute that hadn't been touched for decades. And essentially, what came before you was an update to that, which Charles Schwab Bank, as a result, is now in Henderson, Nevada. And this is part two of that, and hoping that they may ultimately expand their business. And this is their retirement accounts and IRA accounts. And I'll turn it over to Robert Woltz, who's the Vice President Associate Counsel, and Jeff Brown, who's Vice President and Head of Government Affairs, and they can explain where we've been, how this works. It's essentially codifying federal law because Nevada law really didn't contemplate these types of accounts, at least clearly, and they'd be able to answer any questions that you may have. But I think this is ultimately good economic development. Again, looking at our banking statutes for the first time in a long time, and hopefully this will bring other banks to and other financial institutions to Nevada in the future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robert Woltz, representing Schwab. I'm a Vice President and Assistant General Counsel of Charles Schwab Trust Bank. And as Alfredo mentioned, along representing Schwab is Jeff Brown, who is our Senior Vice President, responsible for all legislative and regulatory affairs for the entire Schwab organization. I know most of you have probably heard of Schwab, but I don't know that you're all aware that the Schwab organization has had a banking presence in Nevada going back almost 20 years now, starting with Charles Schwab Charles Schwab Bank, which was a federally chartered bank that was originally headquartered in Reno. Currently, we have two Nevada chartered financial institutions that are primarily engaged in trust businesses and currently headquartered in Henderson, Nevada. Charles Schwab Trust Bank, which is a Nevada savings bank under Chapter 673 of Nevada statutes. That institution conducts an institutional trust business that provides trustee and custodial services to employee benefit plans. It currently has in excess of $300 billion in trust and custody assets and almost $11 billion in deposits, those deposits being mostly sweep deposits and institutional deposits relating to the underlying trust and custody accounts. Our other Nevada entity is Charles Schwab Trust Company, which is a non-depository trust company providing personal trust services that include investment management. Our Nevada trust company, Charles Schwab Trust Company, is also the parent of Schwab's Delaware non-depository trust company. And combined across those two entities, we have $11 billion of trust assets that we administer on behalf of Schwab clients. We've been in Charles Schwab Trust Company is relatively recent. I think we chartered that about 5 years ago. Trust Bank a little bit after that. But because we've found through our recent experience in Nevada that it provides an excellent environment for us to conduct these trust businesses, particularly on the personal trust side. Nevada has really outstanding trust statutes. The Trust and Estates Bar in Nevada has done a really fine job keeping Nevada statutes in a place that are competitive with any trust jurisdiction in the country. When Schwab started personal trust, we started in Delaware. People have heard, a lot about Delaware trusts and Delaware being a progressive trust jurisdiction. I think the trust bar at this point believes Nevada is the equal or even better than Delaware, and that's a tribute to what you all have done through the years in making this a great jurisdiction for trust. What we're seeing though is as our organization grows and evolves, we've changed a lot. I've been at Schwab for over 10 years, and during that time, the perspective of the organization has changed from being a broker-dealer to what we really are, which is a bank holding company as regulated by the Federal Reserve. And the organization has a greater appreciation of the benefits and capabilities that our trust charters can provide to facilitate the objectives of our Schwab organization and our clients. As we increase the use of these Nevada entities, it drives the growth of our presence here in terms of the number of employees and the related resources we are requiring to maintain the employees in our Henderson headquarters. In recent history, we purchased USAA's investment management and trust business over the last year, which we added, I think, 3 employees to our trust company in Henderson. We're also doing some other work for our own broker-dealer as a collateral agent, and business like that also requires us to add employees. So we're adding employees. We're at 40, 50 employees for the trust company, and we anticipate it to grow. The company's doing well. As I said, we chartered it about 5 years ago. It is now very profitable, and it's growing rapidly. So we expect that growth to continue. That's really the reason why we're here, because we need to expand the role of our trust entities, and in order to do that, we need some clarifications to Nevada law. The big expansion that we're looking at currently is the possibility of transferring the custodial role for our individual retirement account program that is currently maintained with Charles Schwab & Company's broker-dealer to one of Schwab's banking and trust charters. And here I'll get a little bit into the technical weeds. A broker-dealer that serves as sponsor of an IRA program under Section 408 of the Internal Revenue Code is required to qualify as a non-bank custodian under the requirements of the Internal Revenue Code. If we can move that responsibility to a bank or trust company, it relieves us from certain Internal Revenue Code requirements that apply to non-bank IRA custodians and allows us to structure our IRA product in a framework consistent with what our competitors are doing. Both Fidelity and Vanguard, 2 of our largest competitors, both have it structured in this way, where their affiliated trust company is the sponsor of their IRA product, which is largely serviced and through the capabilities of the broker-dealer as a sub-custodian. It's anticipated that the Nevada entity that we choose to serve in this role will serve as both the sponsor of the IRA program and as the custodian of the assets for the accounts. All these accounts are self-directed accounts. The trust company or the trust bank will not be acting as an investment manager of these accounts. We will not be taking on any discretionary responsibilities that are normally, indicative of a fiduciary relationship. We will be acting at 100% directed capacity, taking directions from the account holder or perhaps an investment manager that the account holder separately engages. So we're not going to be engaging in any fiduciary activity other than we will be holding these assets as a custodian under the terms of an agreement. So in order to facilitate that, we've asked for two clarifications to Nevada law. The first one is that we were looking to refine the definition of what constitutes a fiduciary capacity under Nevada law to make it clear that a trust company or trust bank acting as a custodian, solely as a custodian, is not a fiduciary under Nevada law. Currently, there's a provision in Chapter 669 of Nevada statutes relating to the statute that governs non-depository trust companies like Charles Schwab Trust Company, that if you are an administrator, which is a party defined as one who possesses or controls an asset of an IRA account, you are a fiduciary for purposes of Chapter 669. So arguably, if we decide to do that in Nevada, the custodian holding assets would be considered to be a fiduciary, even though that would be contrary to the law in most, if not all, jurisdictions in the U.S. that would treat a custodian as not a fiduciary capacity. Our proposed amendment seeks clarification that holding assets of an IRA account in a non-discretionary custodial capacity is not a fiduciary capacity under Nevada law. In addition to that, and that change relates only to Charles Schwab Trust Company, we're also asking for a comparable change to the statutes under Section 673, the savings bank statute that governs Charles Schwab Trust Bank, by adopting verbatim the definition of fiduciary derived from the Federal Office of Comptroller of Currencies Regulation 9. And that by its terms carves out custody relationships from the definition of a fiduciary account. The second clarification that the statute is requesting is that it's actually not a clarification, it's a codification of what we are already doing with respect to Charles Schwab Trust Bank. There are rules under Federal Reg 9 that we just talked about dealing with how a bank treats proprietary affiliate bank deposits that are used in connection with trust relationships. Currently, Nevada has adopted this provision of Reg 9 for all types of banking charters other than our savings bank. As Alfredo mentioned, this is a follow-up. We're essentially filling a gap in that law. So we're asking that the provisions of Chapter 673 be amended to incorporate the rule that is already in place under Nevada law for other Nevada charters engaged in trust business in connection with the treatment of trust cash to apply also to our trust bank under Chapter 673. So it's nothing new. It's just an expansion of what Nevada has already approved. I believe the existing rule is under a regulation. We're asking that this be incorporated in the savings bank statute. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions anyone would have.
Thank you. Mr. Alonso, is anyone else going to be a presenter? Will you?
Madam Chair, no, Mr. Wools will be the only person presenting. Mr. Brown's available for questions.
Thank you. Committee members, any questions? Senator Pickard?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for addressing this issue. I've heard about this in the past. The one question I have, though, is, and I don't practice in this area, so forgive the ignorance, but typically in the law, when we talk about fiduciaries, we're talking about a heightened responsibility standard for the individual managing the accounts or the interests of the individual. And with that comes responsibilities that are over and above what we would normally see an arm's length transaction. So by carving yourselves out of this fiduciary language, What is there in the statutory scheme generally, whether that's in the federal context or the state context, that protects the individual account holders?
Great question. In connection with these IRA accounts that we're talking about, Section 408 of the Internal Revenue Code does incorporate sort of minimal fiduciary obligations under statute, and it relates to record keeping. It relates to safety and soundness of the organization that is promoting the program or maintaining the program. It relates to reporting that's required, statement requirements, everything that ensures the transparency that is deemed to be required for that purpose. And I would also add that in connection with these relationships, while the trust bank nor the trust company would be acting in a fiduciary capacity, that doesn't mean that these account holders would not be hiring other entities, including some Schwab entities, that would in fact act as a fiduciary. If they hire, for example, one of the Schwab investment products, we would, as an investment advisor, we would have the fiduciary duties of an investment advisor, but that would not be, again, the engagement would be between the client and that that investment advisor, not between us and not between the account holder and the trust company or the trust bank.
All right. So if I understand correctly, we're making a distinction between the advisor and the operations side, the banking side. So just as we wouldn't necessarily put a bank operation in a fiduciary capacity over someone who's got their savings or checking accounts, that fiduciary capacity is maintained on the advisory level on the side where, for example, I have much of my investments in Schwab accounts. And so I talk to my advisor. That's a different operation, I presume. I honestly haven't paid much attention to that distinction. So they're separate and apart from the entities that are carved out in this bill?
Yeah, that's correct, Senator. The activity that
Give
we're
us your
talking
name.
about
Give
dealing
us
with here
your
is-
name every time you start so the secretary can keep up, okay? Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah. The role that we're trying to clear here is simply acting as a custodian of assets, essentially directed, 100% directed as to everything we do, but for we will commit, as we have to, as a matter of law, to meet the requirements of the Internal Revenue Code as they relate to IRA products, and including the fiduciary rules under Section 408.
Thank you, and that was Robert Woltz for the record. I appreciate that because I want to make sure that whatever we do, we're not putting the consumer who is not sophisticated in these things, we're not putting them in a position of having to more fully understand the banking side of this. So I think that's an important distinction. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Additional questions? Vice Chair Neal? And for those who are responding, please, every time before you answer the question, please state your name so that the secretary knows who's talking, okay? Thank you. Vice Chair?
Thank you. So I have a question on, it's in section 2, page 4, and this is the collateral requirements that are being put in place. And I'm probably going to walk backwards in this bill, so I'm going to start at page 4 and then I'm end up at page 1. But so this is, so I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask some basic ones. So in 8A, when it says the direct obligations of the United States or other obligations guaranteed, I'm trying to get a real life example of what are the other obligations. And also in D, when we talk about the surety bonds being associated, actually not even the surety bonds, the C, the readily marketable securities of the classes, in which a state bank or trust company or other corporation exercises fiduciary power over. I want to know what those are specifically.
Yeah, let me back up. Let me back up a little bit here, Senator. Just to
Mr.
provide
Wolf,
some context.
state your name.
Robert Wolf again.
Hello, Mr. Wolf. State your name.
Yes, Yes, Robert Wolves again. Senator, just let me provide a little context on those collateral rules. These are the rules. We are currently operating under these rules. These are, as I said, the rules that are in place in the state. And we are the Trust Bank is currently operating under these rules, under informal advice from the Nevada Fed. So we're complying with these now. These rules and the types of collateral are fairly uniform. This has been the law, the federal law for acceptable types of collateral. But the idea is they have to be, as a general proposition, they have to be investments that are not subject to principal risk. So there's no ability, that it's going to be adequate at all times. And the rules also require that the amount of the collateral be marked to market on a daily basis. So there's always collateral at, I believe, 102% of the value of the cash balances. So that's the way we're doing it now. The specific types of securities, I don't know what I can add there, other than they are highly liquid types of securities that are not subject to great principal risk. That's the common theme amongst all of those classes. And again, and whether it is acceptable or not is generally at the discretion of the bank regulators, and they've not raised any issues with us to date.
Okay, so thank you for that. So I'm going to ask like a second question, and I don't know if they're related, but I'm going to ask it. So in this bill, you don't want to be the fiduciary, or you would like to be removed from the fiduciary. But in the section that I asked about, you still want to be able to basically do a spread where you do have some fiduciary powers within these other investments. So I'm trying to understand how that works. And then I have another question.
Yeah, Robert Wolves again. I can explain that. As far as Trust Bank is concerned, and I said we're already operating under these rules, Trust Bank does have some fiduciary relationships that are pre-existing. They are directed trust relationships for employee benefit plans, and the cash balances related to those accounts are governed by this rule as fiduciary funds. And as I mentioned, we are operating under this rule now. This rule is being applied to other Nevada bank charters that engage in trust business. We are just asking to have it formally codified before we move ahead with this IRA move, because we want to make sure that we're clear. But this applies to our existing business now, and it's essentially just the codification of the rules that we are currently operating under at the direction of the Nevada Financial Institutions Division.
Okay. And then my next question is on section 2, it's really sub 6 and sub 7. And I read this as your ability to spread someone's money across several different entities. And so, and it's up to the amount that is being insured by the FDIC, right? And so I think what I didn't hear, and I don't know if anybody else knows, but I know that, it could be up to $100,000 that is spread. But I guess what this section took me back to was when we went through the Great Recession, right? And so they had the ability to transfer other individuals' accounts or money to several different entities. People were then looking for their accounts and trying to figure out who now owns or who now has my money. And so I want to know, are we walking ourselves backwards into a space where this was a part of the financial crisis that we were facing because we flexed the rules, right, to allow the money to be placed in different areas, and then when the bank failed, seeking to try to find out where your money was?
Robert Wolves for Schwab. Well, I can speak to that a little bit. Schwab has a program that we use in connection with these accounts, which is referred to as a sweep tower. And basically what that is designed to do is to spread deposit amounts across existing Schwab bank charters in order to allow our clients to have the maximum allowable FDIC insurance. So for example, if someone has $750,000 of bank cash in their brokerage account or their IRA account, they theoretically could have that spread across Charles Schwab Bank. We have 3 bank charters at Schwab: Charles Schwab Bank, Charles Schwab Premier Bank, and Charles Schwab Trust Bank. It is managed as an integrated program under the supervision of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, and it's been working well. It's a selling point. It's similar to what Merrill Lynch and places like that have, but it doesn't go beyond the 3 Schwab banks, and that is also disclosed to any account holder on their statement the amount that they would have in a particular institution at all times.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the indulgence, because I guess my only final question was, I don't understand, I get what you guys are trying to do, but I don't understand how, if you're removed from being the custodian and the fiduciary relationship, how you continue to protect in the spread, right? And so, because the whole purpose of the fiduciary relationship and being a custodian is the protection and safekeeping that is then, I guess, legally applied to you. And now, when I look at 6 and 7, you have the ability to spread the money over to, although integrated, although within Charles Schwab, or if it was Wells Fargo or whatever, how then does the protection and safekeeping apply if something happens? What then are my, some constituent I have, some 80-year-old woman, what are then her rights in this context if we were to pass this bill, right? What then is she able to say, and then she's told, well, we're no longer the custodian and we don't have a fiduciary relationship. I know we used to, but the state law changed. What is that real life scenario of what she's facing and her rights to then go and find out if something wrong happened? Who then does she go after or talk to?
Robert Wolves for Schwab. Well, in the context of these types of accounts, she has a number of avenues. Number one, these are subject to very strict IRS requirements, and if there's a violation there, she can go to the IRS. They can go to the Nevada Fed, obviously, or in the case of Trust Bank, the FDIC, because that is an FDIC insured institution, and raise a complaint. And they can also complain to the Federal Reserve, who is our prudential regulator and is responsible, as the prudential regulator for the safety and soundness of the entire organization, right? All of the component parts of Schwab, and they're on a financial services holding company like Schwab really is sort of an interesting animal. It's not like a standalone bank. It is an interwoven web of financial charters that are also that are supposed to be under the Federal Reserve requirements looked at together, and also the holding company has to serve as a source of strength for that. So we've got a number of institutions that are here to backstop anything that would happen with these trust companies, and we're required to do that. The federal government expects us to do that. So I think that's another protection that I think is appropriate to call out.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hardy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I were to explain this to somebody, I would say that a bank has more stability and this has less stability, but more options to invest than a bank would that has a fiduciary responsibility therefore there may be increased risk with this versus not as much with a savings bank. Is that a fair characterization? And the risk would go both
I don't
ways.
think it is.
I'm not asking, I
I'm
guess,
sorry,
what
Robert
you
Wolf for
think. I'm
Schwab.
asking, is it true or not?
It is not true.
Thank you.
What? Yeah, I mean, what we're asking for here, Senator, is to put Nevada on par with what we would get if we were doing this through a national bank charter or pretty much a charter of any other state. They would not treat a custodian of an IRA program as a fiduciary. The IRS doesn't expect it. The IRS has forms for prototype IRA documents. There's a trust one if you want to act as a trustee, and there's a custodial one. Either form is acceptable. The custodial form is primarily used in the industry because of the fact that these relationships generally don't involve, outside of the investment, which we talked about, the exercise of discretion that is sort of the touchstone of a fiduciary relationship. These are merely holding assets and dealing with those assets as directed by the account holder.
And that was Mr. Robert Wolf. Additional questions? Senator Hardy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I heard you saying is a bank holds on to the asset and this actually invests the asset so that there's a potential to earn more, and that would be the motivation for somebody to go into this. And if there's a potential to earn more, is there a potential to lose more? If you
The bank is
identify
not
yourself,
directing the
that would be
investment.
helpful.
I'm sorry, Robert Wolf for Schwab. The bank is not directing the investments. We are holding investment assets in a custody account for the benefit of the client, and the clients are directing how they want those assets invested. They can engage discretionary investment outside of the trust company or the trust bank, as the case may be, but we are not assuming any investment responsibility with respect to those accounts. And yes, if they do invest in financial assets that have a risk of loss, but we're not talking about. It shouldn't be looked at as we're talking about the difference between investing in equities or keeping money in a bank deposit. These are investment accounts. People invest in a wide range of broker eligible securities in their IRA accounts, and they as a general matter assume that risk.
Committee members, additional questions? Vice Chair?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to ask one final question on this. This applies to the fiduciary account language where it has pretty much 1 through, it looks like 12. And then, because I was listening to this conversation, but what I was trying to get an understanding on, you have in number 10, the fiduciary account means administered by the savings bank acting in the fiduciary capacity of number 10, the investment advisor. And what I'm not clear on is that are they excluded or are they being included in the fiduciary role? Because when I looked at that C, I wasn't clear if this was the category of entities that would now no longer have a fiduciary role, or they do.
I'm sorry, Robert Wolf. I'm sorry. What
It's page
specific
4.
provision of
So page 4, lines 32 through 45.
what is the section?
It says, so there's only like 2 sections, so. It would be section 2, sub 10, and then sub C.
I'm sorry, Robert. Well, I'm not seeing that.
Okay,
citation.
so-
I'm looking at
okay, so if
a
you-
different draft.
If you go to where they are discussing, it says business of a trust company or trust company business. And then in C, it says a fiduciary account means an account administered by savings bank in a fiduciary capacity. Trustee, executor, administrator,
Yes.
that's where I'm at. Do you see it?
In chapter 669.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
it's-
I'm working off a different markup of the statute. I apologize.
so I'm in the bill, right? So if you go to, it's page 4 of the actual, like, the bill that's currently on Nellis. So the fiduciary account language, do you see it? It has a list all the way through 12. Under fiduciary capacity.
Yes. As used in this section, fiduciary capacity means yes.
Okay, so they're in. So they're in. They're all fiduciaries.
Everything listed there is a fiduciary. Yes.
Okay, got it. Okay, so then my next question is on F, this investment discretion, and I'm going back to the spread. So because you're taking yourself out as a custodian and out of a fiduciary relationship, so then what then is the notice that is required now with this new relationship that will exist of not being a custodian? Because investment discretion means that you could have shared authority, whether or not that authority is exercised, to determine what securities or other assets to purchase or sell on behalf of a person. And I was listening to the conversation, but what I'm not clear on is what then is the notice requirement for a non-custodian, non-fiduciary?
A non-custodian, non-fiduciary relationship
Name, please.
is entirely,
Name, please.
I'm sorry, Robert Wolf. A non-custodian, a custodial non-fiduciary relationship is entirely determined by the terms of the agreement between the customer and the bank. Again, a fiduciary relationship is defined by the exercise of discretion. These custodial relationships are hardwired by contractual language. We are not acting at all other than at the direction of the account holder. And I think that's the distinction that I think we're missing. So if we are not required to invest, obviously we're not a fiduciary because we're not assuming that responsibility. And we would not be in connection with these accounts.
Okay, so because this bill is, if we pass this bill, you're not a you would not be a custodian anymore. And so the notice that would be given to,
No.
no? That's
no,
what,
no, ma'am. But Robert Wolf again. We would be a custodian. We are a custodian, but we are not involved in the investment of the asset, and we are not engaging in any discretionary activity with respect to that account. So we are not a fiduciary under that definition that is sort of the common law definition that is in place in most jurisdictions.
okay. So I just want to be able to explain this, right? Like if I vote for this and I go home and I tell my aunt, okay, we passed this bill where your current IRA that you've had since you were a nun in 1956, that bank is no longer has a fiduciary responsibility to your IRA. And now the bill also allows investment discretion to then spread your money. What then notice will she receive to understand that her relationship to Charles Schwab Bank has now been adjusted, and now what rights or duties should she then act on or perform in order to understand this now new relationship?
Senator Robert Wolf for Schwab. Senator, there will be no change in the relationship. The only change is the party that is sponsoring the IRA program and is holding the assets. These accounts that would be moving over currently follow the structure that I have tried to explain, which is that they are self-directed. It will pretty much be transparent, other than telling them that the sponsor of the program has changed from Charles Schwab and Co., a registered broker-dealer under the jurisdiction of the SEC, to Charles Schwab Trust Bank and/or Charles Schwab Trust Company, a Nevada banking or trust organization. The rights and obligations of the account holder, and we're not skating on any responsibility as a result of this change. We're merely taking out one party that is acting as a custodian now, that has certain obligations, and substituting another one. In this case, would be a Nevada banking entity.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, just to elaborate on that, again, we're not doing
Name, please.
anything.
Name,
Oh,
please.
excuse me, Alfredo Alonso, again, Lewis and Roca. The key here is that the only change is the ability for Charles Schwab to park those dollars, those funds in Nevada when they're self-directed. So in other words, I have the ability to direct where I want to spend my money without a broker. That's where that's the only difference in this bill that would allow them to simply treat that money as if it's an account, almost analogous to a savings account, and then I'm directing where the money goes. If it is directed by a broker-dealer, as you saw, it lists out who is a fiduciary then. So really it is we're doing nothing different than any other. I think almost every jurisdiction in the country does the same thing. Nevada's was just unclear, and I think when you hear from the regulators, we went through this with the regulators to make sure that the consumer was protected, that we were doing nothing out of the ordinary here that was of concern to everybody or anybody, and the regulator actually went through the language with us to make sure that what we were doing is essentially codifying either their current regs or federal law, which is in existence to protect the public.
Thanks. I'm gonna dig into it, because on the surface, it gives you pause for concern, right? You
Right.
see changing fiduciary, and you immediately go into the legal context of what it means, which is what Senator Pickard kicked us off with. And ultimately, you're thinking there are legal connections and relationships to that word, right? And you'd either like to keep them and hold on to them, and so you want to understand what is the loss if I say you don't have that fiduciary relationship to me, because that gives me either legal rights or an opportunities to challenge in some way, right? And so that's why I wanted to dig into it.
And Alfredo Alonso, again for the record, and Senator, if you didn't dig, I would think something was wrong. So I fully expect you to, and I think you will get all the answers you need as we go through this. And I think the regulators were very comfortable with this language ultimately. And again, it's difficult to see this in the bill because you already have regulations in place that this is simply codifying. And then you have the federal reg as well. So I think that once you do dig, you'll understand that we're doing nothing out of the ordinary here, simply allowing them to then move those accounts into Nevada, which is again economic development for the state. It's a good thing ultimately, but it'll change from a consumer standpoint. It'll change nothing because again, if you have a broker dealer helping you, there's a fiduciary responsibility there.
Senator Pickard?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second opportunity. I think I'm going to join my colleague in digging, and we'll probably end up with quite a hole. But I want to reconcile a couple of statements, and that is, when we're talking about investment discretion, and we're talking about spreading this over multiple entities, it doesn't sound to me like the investment advisor or the person that's self-directing their investments is choosing how that money is spread, because it sounds like this is an administrative desire to maximize the amount of FDIC insurance that they can get. So they're going to be the ones moving it from one institution to another. And those banks are then driven by their own investments, their own, where are they actually going to park this money? Because they don't just, drop the cash in a bucket. They move it out into the marketplace. So it sounds to me like Schwab then, or any entity that's operating under these rules, would then be the ones investing that money. They would be spreading it out over their different operations. And so they are indeed engaging in investment discretion as to where those funds go. And so if we are excluding them from fiduciary responsibilities as an operation, and then allow them to decide where that money is actually going to be spread, then they are indeed engaging in investment discretion. So can you explain, where I'm missing the boat on this? Because it sounds like that may or may not be the case.
Robert Wolves for Schwab. Yes, Senator, I think there's a little confusion on that. The idea of our sweep tower, that's a sweep program that is available in connection with accounts. Obviously, whoever has investment authority over that account can leave money in cash and have it participate in that sweep tower, or they can invest it in other assets. Again, that's a decision that's made by the account holder, not by Schwab. And I don't believe there's any authority that says that a bank accepting deposits and how a bank, a regulated, a highly regulated banking entity, how they invest their deposit money, whether it's in loans, which we're not doing in Trust Bank, or bank eligible securities. I don't think that imposes any fiduciary obligation. That's an obligation that is monitored by the applicable bank regulators. In our case, the FDIC, the Fed. For our other charters, the state of Texas. But I don't believe that there's any common law fiduciary obligation that attaches to the bank investment process, how they invest bank assets that are placed at a bank for deposit purposes.
Thank you. So compared to the legal minds that you just waltzed with, my question is pretty pedestrian. So years ago, in the military, you had an opportunity to, every paycheck, save some money. And it was invested in a couple of places, and one of the places was ING, I-N-G. And a number of people who retired before 2013, some of who were not sophisticated in the financial ways. ING did a spinoff of Voya, a new financial retirement company. And I'm still getting emails from people who are trying to figure out, number one, do they still have money? Number two, how much is in there? Number three, I don't know if my account for ING is the same as Voya. And I'm mentioning this because I think one of the things that didn't happen, as I can discern it, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but there are a number of people who were like, I had no idea this was coming. And so what am I supposed to do now? So the duties for those who are managing the account are the same, but the account holders are pretty confused as to what just happened. And I don't know if that was getting at what Vice Chair Neal was asking or not, but we can't predict the future, but let me ask that question. Is there anything in place that would say, if this bill passes, that would say to those account holders in plain language, like you're teaching a kindergarten class, plain language, this is what just happened, and this is what it means? Because the third legal tongue will get you confused, but I want to make sure that whatever we're doing, everybody can understand it as clearly as you all do, and there's not the questions that I get from like the folks who used to be with Ing. One person who sent me an email trying to figure it out, over the years had saved something like $42,000, and they're trying to figure out what just happened. So that's a question. Is there anything in place that would say to the person for who has the account or had the account, is there anything in place that would say to them, this is what it was in February of 2021, this is what it will be in October of 2021? And here's the difference. Is there anything that you all can do like that would allay the fears of people who, are not that sophisticated in the financial ways of the world? So, just a question.
Robert Wolves for Schwab. Madam Chairman, we absolutely would do that. I mean, one of the things we pride ourselves on at Schwab is being transparent to our clients and educating our clients. So a change of this sort, we would be required under the IRS requirements to modify the existing agreements to appoint the new custodian and let them know that there's a new custodian. It would be clear. We generally do these things financial transactions are confusing sometimes, but we try to do it in a Q&A format, and we try to keep it as clear and transparent as possible. I would expect we would do the same thing here. I would also note that if we were to make this move would be done in conjunction with and in cooperation with your regulatory bodies, the Nevada Fed, and they would have an opportunity to look at those notices before we made the move if we choose to go that direction.
Okay, so I guess this question is Mr. Keene, our legal counsel. That being said, is there a way to put something like that into the bill, or is that just a bridge too far? To say that, these are the procedures that have to take place so that ordinary account holders would understand what just happened, what's different, and how they move forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Will Keene, Committee Counsel. We certainly could put a transitory provision into the bill that would address any issues that would come up when the bill's enacted and any changes that might be occurring to anybody's account. And Minister Wolfs can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the bill is simply trying to make Nevada law clear that that Schwab will be able to operate one of its affiliates as a custodian of IRAs, and that's why they're being split off in Section 1. And it's something that they cannot clearly do under Nevada law right now, is to operate purely just as a custodian, not as an administrator, but as a custodian. And I'm assuming that right now they have entities which are operating as what's called in statute an administrator, and perhaps using other custodians. They want to be able to use their own entity as a custodian. So they're creating this. It does, anybody who has an account with Schwab, I would think, and once again, please correct me, Mr. Woltz, if I'm not, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but people who are currently operating with Schwab accounts where Schwab is the administrator, will not see any difference because Schwab will continue to be the administrator. It's just that Schwab would move the actual assets from an outside custodian to an in-house custodian, which would be a separate entity in some senses, but would be part of the Schwab web. But we could certainly put a transitory provision in requiring that any impact on anybody's account must be fully disclosed to them. And I don't think that would cause any objections to anyone, but once again, I don't want to speak for Mr. Woltz.
Robert Woltz, I think that's accurate. And again, I just want to emphasize that we don't see that the impact of this account to these accounts is material at all. It's sort of interesting if you look at the Internal Revenue Code. The IRS believes that if these accounts are custodied at a bank or a trust company, that's all they need to do. If it's custodied at a broker dealer, they feel like they need to do a higher level of diligence on those accounts. So from an IRS perspective, we are moving from to a more acceptable, more safe and sound environment, because we're moving it from a broker dealer, which at the time when these rules went in, where maybe the regulation of the broker dealers was called into question. I would submit now that it's very extensive and it's not maybe what it was then, but to a bank, because the idea being, if you have bank regulators involved, you have the constant review that goes on in a regulated bank environment, that these are going to be these accounts, these custody accounts are going to be maintained in a proper and safe and sound manner.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wolf. And here's why I asked the question, because we have now spent 53 minutes trying to explain this, that you all say it's self-explanatory, but for those of us who are not attorneys and don't operate in that field, it could be a little confusing. And I just want to make sure that, especially coming out of the pandemic, when a lot of people don't have the same kind of financial resources, that offer them security, the liquidity is not there. And so anything that happens, if they don't understand it, then it could cause a panic. You understand what I'm saying? So I'd like to see something in the bill that basically explains that in clear language, so that when this bill passes, if this bill passes, everyone who has an account at Schwab understands this is how it started and this is how it is. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Yeah, Senator Hardy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as I understand it, this isn't limited to Schwab. It could be any of those similarly situated financial institutions. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Senator Hardy, Alfredo Alonso again for the record. Again, they'd have the charter in the state of Nevada. So that is the benefit. The hope is that we will see some more of these banks. And again, as Mr. Wools indicated, we're talking about banks. We're not talking about, and there's highly regulated. I think it's probably the safest situation an investor could be in. And so, yes, we want more of these banks in the state of Nevada. We're hoping that this allows for that.
Thank you. Mr. Alonso, if you can get with Mr. Keene, and let's see if we can work out some language so that Senator Hardy pointed out, it's not just Schwab, it's anybody. Okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Committee members, additional questions? Okay, you have any closing statements, or are you ready to get out of the hot seat?
I think I'll cut my losses right now.
Okay, so having said that, we will close the hearing on Assembly Bill. Oh, I'm sorry, public testimony, yeah, thank you. Broadcast, are we ready for public testimony? We'll start off with those who are for, and we'll do 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and 2 minutes per person. And that will be the instructions, those will be the instructions for not just support, opposition, but also for neutral.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. If you would like to testify in support of AB 290, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue.
I'm going to recognize Mr. Kane. Are you? Okay.
Yes, Chair Spearman.
Okay. Recognize Mr. Kane, and broadcaster, as soon as he finishes, then we'll go to the phones. I don't see anyone else approaching the table. Yes, please begin.
Chair Spearman, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Connor Kane, CONNORCAIN. Testifying today in support of Assembly Bill 290 on behalf of the Nevada Bankers Association. And I will say, Chair Spearman, I know you referred to this as the hot seat. It actually feels warm, pretty nice after Mr. Alonso is sitting in it, especially because I get to be in front of all of you. It's a lot nicer than the plastic chairs in the back. But we are in support of Assembly Bill 290. The Nevada Bankers Association is grateful to Chair Howdigy, and I do want to respond to a question that Senator Hardy had about other state chartered savings banks. I believe that Schwab is the only one currently in the state. We do not have any other state chartered savings banks. We would like to see more. We would hope that this bill would help for us to get more state chartered savings banks. And so we are supportive of this and would appreciate your support as well.
Thank you. Questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kane. Is there anyone else in the room? I don't see anyone. So broadcast, let's go to the phones.
Thank you, Chair. Caller with the last three digits of 101, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
This is Terry Reynolds, TerryReynolds, Director for the Department of Business and Industry. We support the changes to NRS 673, and we support this legislation. The Nevada Savings Bank Charter would be enhanced, and what I mean by that is it would be strengthened by the proposed change that would be consistent with the national banking laws. In addition, the change will make Nevada Savings Bank charters more competitive. As Mr. Kane said, that is an important issue for Nevada since we have lost about 50% of our banks during the recession, and we're looking at trying to be more competitive to get more financial institutions into the state. I would also want to point out that Charles Schwab Bank is an amount of funds into the Community Reinvestment Act nationally, over $2 billion, and they have also invested in Nevada in their tenure here. So we're very pleased to have them as a financial institution in our state, and we think that these changes make good sense for the state of Nevada. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, caller. Caller with the last three digits of 306, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. Sandy O'Loughlin, SANDY, Commissioner of the Financial Institutions Division. Excuse me. I'm here today to testify in support of AB 290. This bill makes changes to NRS Chapter 673, Savings Banks, and NRS Chapter 669, Trust Companies, allowing employer-sponsored IRA investments. The bill's requester worked with the Financial Institutions Division prior to submitting the bill for clear content. At this time, we did not anticipate any amendments. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, caller. If you recently just joined us, we are currently in support of AB 290. To testify in support, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, you have no more callers in support at this time.
Thank you. Let's go to opposition.
If you would like to testify in opposition of AB 290, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, you have no callers in opposition at this time.
Let's go to neutral.
If you would like to testify neutral on AB 290, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, you have no callers neutral at this time.
Thank you. Committee members, petition questions? I guess I just have one, because we have a bill making its way through the legislature requiring banks to do some things with respect to their obligations for Community Reinvestment Act. So is Schwab, I heard Mr. Reynolds say that they've been a real good community partner. Are they subject to the Community Reinvestment Act, also known as CRA? The requirements.
Robert Wolves for Schwab. Charles Schwab Trust Bank actually is not subject to CRA requirements. They have received a special purpose bank exemption from the FDIC. because we do not generally engage in consumer activities. We are largely in institutional accounts, custody and retirement accounts for corporate entities, and the FDIC does not require us to do that. That being said, Schwab does have some investments in the Nevada community. Our local employees are involved. Schwab does a lot of volunteering work and a lot of community development work, and our people are involved in that on a regular and ongoing basis.
Thank you, sir. And with that, we will close the hearing on Assembly Bill 290, and we will open the hearing on Assembly Bill 366. Assemblywoman Tolles, welcome. Didn't I just see you a couple of days ago? All right, proceed when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And it's just a delight to be back into a committee room and to see you all. Thank you. I'm here. My name is Assemblywoman Jill Tolles. I represent Assembly District 25 for the record. I'm here to present Assembly Bill 366. And I would like to just briefly describe what this bill does, give a little bit of background, and then introduce some co-presenters with your permission, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. So today I'm here to present Assembly Bill 366, which exempts recordings of certain training activities from the retention, maintenance, and disclosure of healthcare records by mental health professionals. I will be providing the background information, and then Dr. Whitney Owens and the president of the board of the psychological examiners and Lisa Scurry, the executive director of the board, will present the details of AB 366 and answer any questions. The use of recordings to advise, mentor, supervise, and train new mental health practitioners is a widely accepted practice. Trainees may record audio or video sessions with clients for their clinical supervisors to review both prior to meeting for supervision and jointly in supervised sessions. The use of recordings in sessions like these can benefit the clients as well as the trainees. However, for those persons who consent to audio or video recording, it is important that the destruction of the physical artifacts of those recordings take place at the earliest time appropriate. Destroying these artifacts ensures the audio or video recordings are not included in a patient's medical record, and only the written record of the visit remains, in accordance with state law. Specifically, NRS 629.016 requires all practitioners of healing arts, including the professionals covered by this bill, to retain healthcare records as defined by NRS 629.021. Assembly Bill 366 excludes recordings for used for training purposes from the definition of medical records in order to allow for their destruction as soon as appropriate. In essence, this helps protect patient privacy. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of this esteemed committee. Next, I'll have Dr. Owens provide the details of the bill. And then following her presentation, we also have Director Scurry available to answer questions.
Dr. Owens, proceed when you're ready.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Tolles, Chair Spearman, and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Whitney Owens, and I'm the board chair for the Nevada Board of Psychological Examiners. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about AB 366. So audio and videotaping psychotherapy sessions has been a standard practice for training psychologists and other mental health professions for many decades. The purpose of this bill is to clean up discrepancies in NRS that conflict with the APA Ethics Code and establish standards of practice. Our desire to clean up the current language in NRS is to ensure our current way of training future generations of mental health professionals will not be impaired, as most people, if they knew that the audio or videotapes would be a part of the record, would not be willing to have their psychotherapy sessions audio or videotaped due to concerns about confidentiality and privacy. Additionally, students would not be able to have the same level of supervision and training that is afforded through supervisors having access to audio and videotapes of psychotherapy sessions. Not making and using these recordings has negative implications for workforce development in Nevada. Lastly, the amount of potential harm to patients having their sessions recorded and kept as a part of the clinical record is damaging for the patient if accessed and reviewed outside of the context of the whole therapeutic relationship. The Nevada board has reached out to other mental health boards impacted by this proposal and to support the bill, and the third is neutral. This discrepancy in our standard practice in the language in NRS came to the attention of our board through a psychologist working at the University of Nevada, Reno, after their university attorneys told them that they would need to keep their audio and video recordings based on the current language of NRS. As psychologists and other mental health professionals in Nevada currently do not keep the training audio or videotapes, this caused great concern for our board. We obtained an attorney general's decision, and they concurred with the UNR attorney. Essentially, this is cleanup language that allows us to train and educate in the standard that is acceptable and practiced in most other jurisdictions around the country. We're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Senator Pickard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is interesting to me. I view these sorts of things through the lens of a litigator, where it's customary for me to want to get evidence in a case. And so I understand the desire to destroy these records if they are used purely for purposes of training. However, I'm also aware that there are a number of practitioners who record often through video means, their sessions. It allows them to take better notes, to more fully understand the colloquy between the patient and the therapist. And so I assume that those would remain as part of their records, that this only affects records made for purposes of training. Is that correct?
Whitney Owens for the record. That's a really great question. And I don't think that that's standard of practice for most mental health professionals to audio or videotape our sessions unless we're doing some kind of training. So for example, there might be licensed professionals who would record their sessions for the context of receiving consultation or other kind of peer supervision or things like that. But the standard of practice is then to destroy them and not keep them as a part of the record. Really, it's a way of ensuring the best treatment for the patient and ensuring that they get the best treatment that they can without having it as a part of their clinical record that could be later used against them or could later be accessed by family. So as I was sharing this with a colleague, one of the things that they mentioned is they said, oh my gosh, I would not want to have access to my father's records after he dies. What if he talked about hating being a parent, and then your child has access to all of your mental health records. As mental health professionals, we document the session, we document the methods that we're using, the response from the patient, but we don't tend to document exact statements from the patient for that reason, because if they do get access that could be used against them in a way that was never intended or not the purpose of the session. Most people coming to therapy wouldn't come to therapy if they knew that their records would be able to be used against them in such a kind of egregious way.
No, and I appreciate that. Oh, go ahead, Assemblywoman Toles.
Assemblywoman Toles.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I would just like to point out in Section 1 of the bill, it does reference that NRS 629.021, outlining the practices for healthcare records, includes meaning any reports, notes, orders, photographs, x-rays, or other recorded data or information, whether maintained in written, electronic, or other form, which is received or produced by a provider of healthcare or any person employed by a provider of healthcare and contains information relating to the medical history, examination, diagnosis, or treatment of the patient, is still remaining in statute. And therefore, all of the appropriate regulations and laws regarding keeping and maintaining those records are still protected in statute. Just specifically what the language that we are adding right under that is that the term does not apply to the recording used for training activity and so forth.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. As I was going through Section 2 and 3, and I look at, if these records were used initially or recorded initially for the purpose of maintaining a more robust understanding by the therapist, and then if they had the proper informed consent, then they could be used in training. But now we're starting to kind of blur the line a little bit, where it wasn't initially and solely recorded for the purposes of training, but was also part of the therapeutic process in terms of the practitioner's understanding. We've got a blurred line, and so I want to make sure that, and I also recognize this is different from a forensic evaluation, where the purpose of the evaluation is for to generate evidence, right? And of course, those are a separate beast. But we've got potential for blurring of the lines, and I would hate to think that we would have and there are also confidentiality requirements. In fact, it's illegal or improper, it's a violation of ethical rules for a practitioner to make any records that they've taken in the course of therapeutic evaluations, to make those available to anyone without the informed written consent of the patient. And so those protections would remain. And I would presume that, although I don't recall reviewing in statute or in regs a destruction requirement at the end of a person's life, that if they were to die in the middle of the therapy, that those records would then be destroyed and not available to the families, to the doctor's point. But my concern is this, that if we're not clear on the record that this applies to recordings that are made for the purposes of training, then those records should remain, even if those records are subsequently used in some training capacity, even though that was not the original intent. I want to make sure those records are retained, because particularly when we get into malpractice and other kinds of issues, we need those records. And the video record is often much better than the recorded record.
Madam Chair, if I may. Thank you, and I appreciate your concerns. And again, all those other statutes would still remain in place, but I would direct the members of this committee to Section 2, subsection 1B, which says that the patient has provided informed consent to the use of the recording in the training activity in response to the questions about whether or not any lines are blurred. This would be very specifically something that we would have a record of informed consent, that it is for the purpose of training, and that's the limitation of this provision in this proposed language that you would be adopting.
I appreciate that. And again, mine is the other side of that coin, where it wasn't originally recorded for the purposes of training, even though they may ultimately get an informed consent to allow it to be used in training subsequently. If it is a recording of a therapy session with the purpose of aiding the therapy, I think that that's an important distinction that we might want to make. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Additional questions? Senator Hardy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You talk about opening up a bag of worms. This is great. So if a person dies, does the family have access to their records? Question mark?
Dr. Whitney Owens, they can. It's possible to access records, posthumously. And I think, after I said that, I realized that was a little outside of the scope of this bill. And though it also provides good rationale as to why we don't want to keep, especially if the intention is just for training, we don't want to keep an audio or video recording for that reason and many, many others.
So if we as a physician, I'm talking as a physician now, destroy a record, I can see Senator Pickard's concern about that. So we have an obligation to retain records. And I was looking through all of these people specifically noted, and I didn't see the word psychiatrist in all the things that you were looking at. Psychologist, marriage and clinical professional and social, but I didn't see the word psychiatrist. And I'm thinking, did you leave that one out on purpose? And then in retrospect, I'm just going to give you all the questions. In retrospect, does this allow people who have now got the records to destroy the records, or is this going forward? And can you sometimes say that the training is for the patient? So if you record the patient in some state and play it back 6 months later or a year later, are we not training the patient to see where they've been and where they're going and where they are? And obviously the psychiatrist is under a different board, but that board will have requirements for retention of records and who can get the record. And so those are questions that I have, and I'll give you some rope, do whatever you want with it.
Whitney Owens for the record. We did reach out to the medical board, and they had no comment for us. We weren't able to get any support or opposition for this bill for them. I think it's a bit more complicated as psychiatrists are under the full medical board, and I can see situations where they might want to retain audio or video recordings in the medical world for various purposes. I forgot the second part of your question. I'm so sorry. But so that was the part for the medical board. And if you could restate your second question, I would really appreciate it.
Retrospectively destroy records? Does this allow somebody to keep the records, or they have to destroy the records that they have?
Whitney Owens for the record. The standard of practice for training records is that the trainee would take the audio or video recording. They might listen to it for their own purposes, for their, to critique their work, and they would provide it to their supervisor for use, either to listen to prior to supervision or in supervision. And then after that, it's immediately destroyed. That's the standard of practice for mental health training in most jurisdictions.
So this one would not actually give you obligation or permission to destroy records that have been used for training in the past?
Whitney Owens for the record. No, it wouldn't give any permission to destroy previous records. This is standard of practice, and until it came to our attention, most training records are consistently destroyed after they're listened to and after supervision takes place. So it wouldn't give permission to destroy any previous records that were kept, any previous audio or video recordings that were kept. It would just give permission to continue doing what we're doing already.
And it would allow you to do this for training purposes of the patient or just the people that are listed?
Just for training our students. So postdocs, interns, psychological trainees, or social work interns. It would just allow us to not keep those records. In terms of training our patients, so we don't typically keep any record of that. So in certain therapies, patients may record themselves outside of session, engaging in skills training or things like that, but that never goes into their clinical record. That's owned by the patient. It's documented in the clinical note that we're assigning patients homework or things like that, but those have never been a part of the clinical record as it's owned by the patient because it's made by the patient.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Neal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what I had, my questions were the length of time that the recordings would be used, the number of uses, and the number of persons who would have access during the training to the actual recordings. And then you could just kind of take these all at once. And then the fourth is what happens if there's a disclosure, like a disclosure related to either criminal activity, fraud, et cetera, things that may trigger some legal liability around within that training, and that patient discloses something, or in this case where you have the family therapist piece, and they disclose something that may be related to their divorce or what's probably going to help them get one. Anyway, I was just wanted those questions.
Whitney Owens for the record. So in the case of who would have access to that training tape, it's all detailed in our informed consent. So when a patient comes in for therapy, they know exactly who's going to have access to that record. So if the student is sharing it with their advisor or their supervisor, it's detailed in that informed consent. If it's shared with a consultation team, it's detailed in the informed consent. So the patient knows exactly who has access to that, who will be listening to that. And then most informed consents will say that upon conclusion of the supervision, the audio tape is, destroyed immediately. So, depending on the frequency of supervision, which is typically weekly, the audio or videotape might stay live for a week or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, maybe up to 2 weeks, but typically they're destroyed pretty quickly. And then in terms of it being accessed for, for like a family therapy situation, if there's a court case, typically because the informed consent states that the audio or videotape would be destroyed, it is the contract that we have with a patient that's not a part of their record, that it's going to be destroyed. And so from the outset, patients are informed that that's not something that they're going to be able to, they aren't going to be able to access that themselves because it's not a part of the record. And then they aren't going to be able to access that for legal proceedings in the future because it's meant for training purposes only. Any other parts of the therapy are documented in the clinical note. And that record is kept, per clinical note rules in NRS and timelines, but it's all documented in the notes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Scheibel.
Thank you. I have a couple of clarifying questions as well, and I think my colleague Senator Hardy alluded to this or almost got there. My question is, I think what you said was that this came to your attention because psychologists at UNR were creating these tapes for training purposes. They were destroying them as is normal practice, and they were told by counsel that they had to retain them, and the Attorney General weighed in and agreed. So I assume that they have been retaining them since. So for that small group of recordings, what's going to happen?
Whitney Owens for the record. No, they actually stopped right when their attorney informed them of this. And so they haven't been using audio or videotapes for training purposes, which is our concern, is that if we had to keep all of our audio and video recordings, we would not use those for training purposes. We would have to either sit in with our trainees, which would drastically reduce the mental health workforce in Nevada, because instead of having two providers able to provide services at the same time, you would only have one because we would have to be in the room or behind like a two-way mirror, which was what we kind of did before audio and video recordings were very possible. And so we wouldn't even have those records. No one would keep them. We would just have to be in person doing supervision.
Okay, Now I understand. Thank you. And I have a follow-up question, which may be a little bit outside the scope of this bill, but I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to how the practice has changed with the implementation of new technology. I'm imagining, if I were a marriage and family therapist, I would record that session on my iPhone in the session, and then I'd probably go home and listen to it on my computer as a student or as a trainee, and then delete it from both places. But again, I don't know if it's outside the scope, but I was wondering if you could speak to whether we need to address specifically the issue of cloud storage of these recordings or duplication of these recordings, or if there is another program or software that mental health professionals use that I'm not aware of.
Whitney Owens for the record. So all mental health professionals are bound by HIPAA. And so anytime we make any kind of electronic record of anything, we're required to have two-factor authentication. So making sure that we have 2 blocks before somebody could access the information. So an iPhone would not meet that metric. We aren't able to use our iPhones to record sessions. Some standards of practice are just to use an old-fashioned, audio recorder. Sometimes we'll use good old-fashioned VHS. Things are coming along rapidly, but we're working really hard with IT companies to make sure that we can meet that HIPAA standard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Settlemeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the line of questioning. It brings up a whole lot of other questions, unfortunately. And in that respect, I think what I'm looking at is, so if we pass this bill, it means that once again, potentially they will be utilizing this resource, recording devices, for training purposes. But then, of course, myself, before I can vote on the bill, I need to know about the accessibility of individuals to this information and the admissibility of that information potentially in any legal setting. That's where I start to get very concerned. If you're stating that if someone as a family member has the ability to access these records, under what circumstances? And that's where I'm very concerned. Is it only if they die and you're trying to find out why they passed away, or is this in a situation where someone is committed or maybe needs to be? I don't know. That's where I'm starting to worry. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, someone from the panel.
Yeah, so I wish I wouldn't have, Whitney Owens, I wish I wouldn't have used that example, because the reality is that if this doesn't pass, our mental health professionals will just no longer use audio or video recordings for training purposes. For that reason, is that we wouldn't want those to be kept as a part of the clinical record. They were never meant to be a part of the clinical record. That's not the way patients understand it. In our informed consent, we specifically state this is for training purposes only, to make sure that you get the best care possible, to make sure that you don't just have the student's eyes on you, you have the licensed professional's eyes on you. And so if this doesn't pass, our whole training community will have to get really creative in figuring out how do we provide high quality supervision of our next generation of mental health professionals. And the solution will be that we have to do in vivo supervision in person, which will drastically reduce the workforce. So it's been standard of practice. I would be surprised if there are too many audio or video recordings out there right now, since we found this out a year or two ago. We've sort of stopped using audio or video recordings to do our training. And so if this doesn't go through, there won't be access to records because we won't use them and we won't keep them.
Senator Lang for the record. So along the same lines, what I'm really concerned about is I understand the informed consent, but once there's a video or once there's a recording, those can go anywhere. And so for training purposes, do those recordings stay in a particular building,
do they go out? Do people take them home? It's so easy to make copies. When we start recording, I think it opens a whole different can of worms. And so I'm just trying to figure out how we can control and maintain the fact that these are only for training purposes to be used for that time and then disposed of. I think you get where I'm going.
Whitney Owens for the record. Yeah, so we have just the same concerns as you. We don't want those records to go anywhere they're not supposed to go. And so we're bound by HIPAA. We have to create an assurance that those records are kept, under lock and key, and only accessed by who they should be accessed by. Each practice, each company is mandated to have a policy and procedure as to how they're keeping these audio and video recordings. And if they don't follow that, policy and procedure, and perhaps those records do get out, then our board would hear the complaints about that. And we would, we're in charge of regulating that to make sure that psychologists and mental health professionals are ensuring that they're following their rules and regulations. And still, we would never want that to happen. And so that's why we have the HIPAA rules in place to ensure that those records are kept, in a confidential, secure way until they're destroyed.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Owens, I had flashbacks of doing my doctoral research and sending out the notices to the people who had consented. The Institutional Review Board has to look at your entire study, and they have to make sure that the people who participate are protected. And so I had to send out a consent form to everyone and then get it back. And then when I taped the interview, I had to tell them this is what I'm doing. It's about global energy policy, and I'm just trying to understand what that looks like from your perspective as a professional, blah, blah, blah. And IRB required me to keep those records for 5 years and then destroy them. And that's just in case anybody had a question about my research or the validity of my conclusions. Is there anything like an IRB? Because I'm pretty sure that people who go through the training of mental anything, psychiatrists, psychologists, we had to do the same thing when I was in seminary. And we had, training sessions, as it were, where we would talk about some of the things that we encountered and kind of work through that as a way for, if it didn't happen to me, but it happened to one of my student colleagues, then I would learn about that and also learn how to address the issue if it came up. Is there anything that we can glean from the IRB, Institutional Review Board, that would probably address the questions of, number one, why would it be necessary? Number two, how do we protect that? Because when you're doing research with human subjects, it's very, very strict. And you have to put down exactly what you're doing. I mean, you can't even you can't substitute an if for an and. Is there anything that we could learn from that process that might be helpful in understanding this legislation?
Dr. Whitney Owens, it's a great question that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer thoroughly, but I'll do my very best. The difference, I think, is research versus treatment. So when we're training our students, we aren't engaging in the practice of research. We're using the research to make sure that we're delivering the most evidence-based practices to our patients that we can. And so we aren't conducting research, we're using it to make sure that the treatment that our patients get are good. And so the purposes of the recordings are for that training, so that those of us who are licensed and experienced in the field can provide feedback to our students so that the next session that they have with the patient, they're staying on track with that evidence-based program, and that they're staying on track to move forward. We don't use the recordings after the ones, after the review of the one session. And, again, back to, we wouldn't keep those records because patients wouldn't sign up to be recorded if they knew that those records were kept. Many patients already refuse treatment with students because of being recorded or video recorded. They just don't want that as a part of their record. It's just not a part of clinical practice that we typically tape our sessions for that reason. People really want confidentiality and privacy. Patients are scared to come into therapy. We don't want to offer another barrier that makes them even more scared to come into therapy. Having people know that every word that they say, if they say, "I hate my children," and that could come on, back to them later, or, telling really vulnerable, scary things about yourself, and you knew that that was recorded and somebody was going to use that against you, why would you ever go to therapy? You just wouldn't. And so, we don't want to create another barrier for our trainees to not get the best experience that they can and the best supervision that they can. And we don't want to, create such a burden on supervisors that they have to be in session with their students at all times, because then supervision becomes a burden and not a joy. And so our ability to train future generations would just decrease tremendously. Supervisors would stop supervising because it wouldn't be very cost efficient for them. They wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't be able to support the cost of supervision. And so we wouldn't be able to have a pipeline of supervisees in our workforce. And so, the whole purpose of this bill is to continue to do what we've already kind of been doing, to ensure that we get the best trainees, the best people out there to provide good mental health, and doing it in a way that assures confidentiality and privacy for folks who seek therapy.
Thank you. And so I was basically talking about the process, the names, and the individuals might change. We did the same thing when I was training to be a trauma chaplain. It's called a verbatim. We didn't have iPhones and things of that nature back then. It's stubby little pencil and a pad, and then our supervisors would critique us, as well as our other colleagues. Is the process, that's all I'm talking about, just the process of getting consent and then having a time or a phase, if you will, of the treatment that the recording would be destroyed. Because I think what I'm hearing, if I'm understanding the questions that are being asked, it's the recording itself and what if it gets out. So if the process is for the IRB, for the Institutional Review Board, I had to keep all of my records, all the recordings, everything for 5 years. And trauma chaplain training, after that semester was up, or our stint at the hospital was up, we had to destroy everything. So it was a start and an identifiable end, if you will. I'm just talking about the process, not training but just the process.
Whitney Owens, I want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So the question is there a detailed outline in the informed consent about how long these recordings are kept? Is that the question that you're on?
Yes, ma'am, because I may be misunderstanding, but the questions that I hear from my colleagues, from the committee members, is that it getting into the wrong hands. And so they sign an informed consent. As a part of that informed consent, is there any way to identify here's the start and here's the stop, so that everybody is clear on when it happens? And someone brought up the fact if the person, the patient, is deceased, this is what happens. So that it's clear to everybody, and there's no ambiguity, and some of the concerns of the committee members are addressed in that IRB process, just the process.
Whitney Owens for the record. Okay, thank you for that clarification, Senator Spearman. So in our informed consent, it specifically states that the patient will, the patient agrees to being recorded. They'll be recorded in the session that they have with the student, and then the recording is destroyed after the supervision. And so there's no specific timeline like 1 week or 2 weeks. And part of that is to create a bit of latitude to make sure that, a bit of latitude so that if supervision occurs within, like a week and a half of the session or 2 weeks of the session, we don't have a specific timeline, but it is destroyed right after the supervision occurs. In terms of the clinical record, the recording isn't kept in the clinical record. So many mental health professionals have switched to an electronic health record. And in order to be kept as a part of that record, it would have to be uploaded into the electronic health record, which is not standard practice and doesn't happen. So typically it's kept on a separate recorder, whatever that device is, whether it's a video recorder or an audio recorded, and that's kept in a separate place, under lock and key per HIPAA rules. So, as long as practitioners are following their HIPAA rules, then in terms of confidentiality and privacy, the risk wouldn't be that it would be released within the clinical record, unless we don't change the language. If we do, then that's a different story. But if the language is changed, then the recording never becomes a part of the clinical record. It's kept separately. And then if somebody were to pass away, the same practice would happen. So if somebody passed away, then the supervisor might have a final supervision about that patient with the supervisee, and then it would be destroyed.
Okay, thank you. Is there language in the bill, Assemblywoman Tolles, that captures that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question, and happy to have the director also respond if your question is in regards to whether or not there's a length of time specifically outlined in the statutory change. In my review of the bill, that's not included in here, but it is my understanding that that could be addressed through regulations, and that might be a more appropriate place, frankly, for that to be addressed, because then in each individual practice, they could determine the guidelines, I believe, for the security of the recordings, as well as for the timeline as appropriate for each professional setting.
And that's what I was getting at. Someone says something to a therapist about a divorce, then they get a divorce. Somebody says something, and then it comes back to haunt them. And I guess, what just struck me is, I guess maybe similar to what happens when you have medical interns doing rounds with doctors, and they see the patient, and they know everything that's going on. They look at the chart, and then they make some type of assessment. Again, making sure that there's, a finite time, and everybody understands what that is. It's just the process. It doesn't have to be in a particular place, but it's the process, kind of like Dr. Seuss in a plane, on a train. It doesn't matter. So that's what I'm looking for. And if I understand it correctly, I think that's the concern of the committee members. How do we address it? And I have no problem if we put in statute the infrastructure that would guide people who would be setting this up based upon their individual practice or what needs to happen, et cetera. And then we can put the specifics in the NAC. But just something to address the questions about, okay, so what happens if this? What happens if that? So just tighten it up a little bit. Are you amenable to that?
Absolutely, Madam Chair. Jill Tolles for the record. Absolutely, of course. And I do appreciate all the questions, and I appreciate the concern for the patients. And that really is what this bill is about, is making sure that we are protecting the patients. And so I commend the members of this committee for having that first and foremost in their mind, and I think that that would strengthen and make the bill even better. 100% amenable to taking a look at how we could add any clarifying language. And I just, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pickard.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the second opportunity. Just a quick follow-up on a couple of comments. When I first read this, I didn't envision this was a training in the context of supervisor-supervisee. I was thinking in terms of a classroom experience. We're recording this for the purpose of, using this multiple times to teach students at the university setting in how to do this. And so this bill doesn't distinguish between those two uses. But I'm particularly intrigued by the discussion about the informed consent form because it sounds like, number one, it's a standard form, but then there was a comment from Dr. Owens about, that there may be different forms used by different people. Does the current regulatory structure require a specific form with certain content? Or, how much control do we have? Are we sure that every informed consent form actually covers the things that we've discussed today? Or is that just an assumption that a good practitioner would do so?
Dr. Whitney Owens for the record. So it is in our ethics code and it's a really great question that I don't know the answer to. It's just what we do. We follow our ethics code. I do believe legally that we have to have it in our informed consents. There's no one standard informed consent. Just like when you go to your physician's office, your physicians have their own stylized way of doing their informed consents, but there are necessary parts that are included in the informed consent. And so I'm imagining that that's in statute somewhere, and it's also a part of our ethics code. So it has to be in our informed consent if that's what we're doing. If it's not in our informed consent, then our board hears those complaints, and those psychologists become, disciplined for that. But they do have to be in our informed consent.
All right, that's comforting because that would be critical to make sure that every practitioner is actually getting the same information to the patient, and then it is truly informed consent. Anyway, I'll take the remaining clarification questions offline. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, looks like we are finished with the committee questions. So, Assemblywoman Scholes, you have anyone here in the room that is supporting?
Madam Chair, I don't see anyone. I believe we may have some calling in.
Okay, so broadcast, let's go to the phones now. 15 minutes for, 15 minutes in opposition, 15 for neutral, 2 minutes per individual, and we need to have a hard stop at 2 minutes because we're running over into the floor time. And the only reason I say that is because there's some people that when they look and they see it's going to start at 11 o'clock, they're ready for it to start at 11 o'clock. And if we start at 1, then that's kind of frustrating the system. So broadcast, are we ready?
Yes, Chair. If you would like to testify in support of AB 366, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 498, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You have 2 minutes and may begin. Caller with the last 3 digits of 498, please press star 6 to unmute yourself. You may begin.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm so sorry.
Yes, we can.
Great. Awesome. 1 second. Good afternoon, Chairwoman and members of the committee. My name is Erica Valdrez, ERICAVALDRIZ with the Vegas Chamber. The Chamber is in support of AB 366. The Chamber believes that this bill provides support to mental health professionals, especially during training. We believe that this bill will help improve the system and the behavioral health of our community. Thank you, Chairwoman and members of the committee, for your time. We urge your support for this bill.
Thank you, caller. Chair, you have no more callers on the line in support at this time.
Let's move now to opposition, and if there are no callers there, we'll move immediately into neutral, okay?
Thank you. Chair, your public line is open and working, and you have no callers at this time.
Move to neutral.
Chair, your public line is still open and working, and you have no callers that are neutral at this time.
Thank you. Senatorwoman Tolles, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Chair, members of this committee. Jill Tolles for the record. I do very much appreciate this committee's attention to this matter. And again, I appreciate the questions that were asked. I'm very happy to work with the board and also the members of this committee on ensuring that you are comfortable with the language so that we can move it forward. I do believe that this could very much help with patient privacy and security. And I am concerned, I do share the concerns of the board that if this does not pass, it will have a negative impact on our ability to provide services in mental health settings and at a time when we need it in increasing measure. I definitely want to make sure that we find a way to get the language just right so that we can move this forward. I do want to point out one last thing that was brought to my attention, that currently in our Nevada Administrative Code 641.224, confidential information, including written informed consent, includes recordings have been done, are included in that NAC. And the recordings have been done since recordings have been possible, from my understanding. And to at least to the board's knowledge, there's been no privacy breaches thus far. So they do protect the recordings with their life, and we want to be able to give them that opportunity to continue in a way that would make this body and comfortable and also accomplish our goal here. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we will close the hearing on Assembly Bill 366 and open it up for public comment at this time. Thank you, Dr. Owens, Assemblywoman Tolles. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to speak in public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Again, if you would like to speak in public comment, please press *9 now. Chair, your public line is open and working, and you have no callers at this time.
Okay, thank you. So we'll close out public comment. Committee members, additional questions, comments? All right. So everybody, welcome to our hybrid in the building and on Zoom. And we will be right back at it on Friday at 8 o'clock. If something changes, we'll let you know. But I think we got a couple of bills that are going to take some time on Friday. So with that, we will adjourn this meeting and see you all on Friday. We're adjourned.